I can see your PowerPoint. Looks good.
Excellent. So you got your PhD, right? Did you graduate? You graduated.
Yeah. Unfortunately, my graduation ceremony got canceled due to the...
Oh, yeah, that's frustrating. Well, congrats, brother. Congrats. That's awesome. Huge accomplishment.
Yep. And currently doing an MA at Southern Evangelical Seminary in Biblical Studies as well.
Yeah, all that. That's great. You told me that last time we talked. That's great. Hold on just one second. Yeah, I think everything's good. Yeah, so Boris Johnson has it, huh?
Yeah, and Prince Charles as well.
Wow. It's wild. It's a wild thing. You know, you never even would have thought this would have happened. Yep. This wasn't even on the radar. Did you see that Bill Gates TED Talk, how he kind of predicted this?
No, I didn't.
Yeah, it's pretty amazing. Bill Gates did a TED Talk about 3 years ago, and he basically laid out what he thought was going to happen inevitably, which is this kind of a worldwide epidemic of some sort of disease that we wouldn't be able to cure. And yeah, you need to watch it. It's pretty fascinating.
Oh, look, yeah. So we're streaming live on YouTube as we speak.
Great.
Next Saturday, I've got a recording of a debate I did in January, premiering on Premier Christian Radio on the topic of the resurrection.
Oh, great. Who did you debate?
It was a guy called David Johnson. He's a skeptic. He has a podcast called Seekers and Skeptics.
Oh, great. It's great. Yeah, I've actually been talking to Justin about a thing on there. So hoping that'll happen. I'll let you know if that comes through. That'll be exciting.
So you're did you mention you're coming out with a book on this topic?
Yeah. If you look at the center of my PowerPoint, that's the cover of my book. It comes out actually April 8th, so it's just about to come out. But yeah, this is a book I've been working on for a few years, but I've been talking to. But it's kind of the culmination of 20 years of my focus on the resurrection, kind of my what I consider the best case that can be made on the resurrection. So really focused on the historical side. So
excellent.
Yeah, gotta pre-order it. Pre-order now. That's what I've been doing a lot of different things. It's been nice, you know. The Lord's been good. I came here with all these plans and all these, you know, speaking engagements, and all of them got canceled pretty much, but they've also moved to online. So I feel like I'm reaching more people with the message of Christ crucified and risen again. So it's worked out.
Yeah, unfortunately, I was supposed to be going to do a Malaysia tour in May and June, but that's unfortunately cancelled because of the COVID-19 as well. I'm teaching my classes for college online though.
Yeah, I'm still teaching my class back in Jordan through Zoom. My 2 classes. So we have an 8-hour difference, and we're on the other side of the world. We're doing it all through Zoom. It's amazing.
Yeah, I really like Zoom. You know, on Zoom you can actually do breakout sessions. I just learned a couple weeks ago. You can split people into random groups, and have them do group discussions, and the host can enter between the rooms, enter and leave rooms, and call them back when he wants.
I didn't know that. Just learning it. I've been most of my talks have been on Zoom, and I'm doing the class, but others have been setting it up for me, so I haven't really been able to learn much about it yet, but it's really great. What a blessing. Whoever came up with Zoom had no idea how it would be used for the kingdom.
Yeah. And Zoom, I think, it's really exploded due to the COVID-19 crisis.
Yeah, definitely has.
I guess they're doing very well, and I bet Netflix is doing quite well as well out of it.
Yeah, I'm sure there's a conspiracy theory out there somewhere that the creator of Zoom started the coronavirus.
Yeah, I've actually come across, unfortunately, COVID-19 deniers. I think it's all government conspiracy. And
yeah, of course. There's always going to be those.
Let me just go ahead and introduce you, and then we'll maybe crack into it. Hello, folks. If you're just joining us, this is the Apologetics Academy webinar series that I run. The website is apologetics-academy.org, and we bring on different scholars and speakers representing perspectives from across the theological spectrum to present on topics of interest to Christians, especially those pertaining to the question of whether or not the message of Christianity is true. And we also cross-examine and evaluate other worldview perspectives as well. So we normally have a presentation for up to an hour or so, and then we transition into a period of open floor Q&A and discussion and dialogue. And this evening, we're very privileged to have with us Dr. Justin Bass, who is a biblical scholar, and he has written a book called The Bedrock of Christianity, which is on the topic of 1 Corinthians 15, verses 3 through 8, which is an early creedal tradition that Paul passes on to the Corinthian Christians. And he's going to talk to us about its relevance to arguments for the resurrection of Jesus. So without further ado, I'll turn over to Dr. Bass. Thanks for being with us.
Thank you, Jonathan. Blessed to be here with you again, and enjoyed the previous ones I did, one on the Dead Sea Scrolls and one on the claim of Jesus to be the Son of Man. So people can look those up on your site. And, just love this format and go in depth on some of these very important issues. And that's what I want to do this evening. Is I want to try to go as in depth as I can with the time we have into what I call in my upcoming book, as Jonathan said, the Bedrock of Christianity. I call it the bedrock source of Christianity. This text, 1 Corinthians 15 through 8. One scholar called it the pearl of great price. He wasn't talking about the Joseph Smith nonsense.
Justin, your audio is a bit rough. Maybe you're too close to your microphone or something.
Okay, let me try to back up a little bit. Is that better?
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Okay. Yeah, one scholar called it the pearl of great price. I always liked that. It actually comes from Jesus, and so it has nothing to do with Joseph Smith or his nonsense. We're talking about this irreplaceable treasure that's tucked away in 1 Corinthians 15. And this is really the most ancient, most reliable, undisputed testimony and evidence for the death and resurrection of Jesus that we have on record. And I just want to show in our time this evening, actually just give a taste at least of how firm, how unshakable a foundation this historical bedrock on which the believer stands is, especially with Easter coming up. But first, I thought you and your audience would be interested in just looking briefly at the earliest evidence of really anything in the Bible. What's our earliest historical evidence of any story or claim in the Bible? And of course, in this case, we would be talking about the Old Testament. I think the most ancient written evidence unearthed thus far was discovered in 1896. And it's known as the Merneptah Stela. I beheld it myself in all its glory. It's at the Cairo Museum. And so I'm actually in Texas right now, but I've been living in Amman, Jordan for the last 3 years, teaching as a professor of New Testament at Jordan Evangelical Theological Seminary. And so I got to hop over to Egypt a few years ago. And of course, I went to the Cairo Museum. And what we have here is Pharaoh Merneptah, who reigned from 1213 to 1203 BC. He was the son of Ramesses the Great, much more well-known pharaoh. But he, like many of the ancient rulers, enjoyed carving his victories into stones. And that's what we have here. This inscription includes the pharaoh's victorious line, "Israel is laid waste, and the sea is not." This is what's in the hieroglyphics, actually, kind of in a zoomed in form there on the slide. I can't read it. Not many can read the ancient hieroglyphics, but if you trust the scholars, that is exactly what they unanimously agree that it is saying. It is talking about Israel as the Bible is telling the story of Israel. This is specifically the nation of Israel. So this takes us back to 13th century BC as an actual outside the Bible historical evidence of the nation of Israel. Ironic, of course, that the descendants of Pharaoh have been laid waste. Their seed is not. They ended with Cleopatra, and Israel yet is still a nation today, over 3,000 years after this was written. So too bad Pharaoh Merneptah is not around to enjoy that irony. But there's a few interesting things that you could date before this. You have, of course, some references to Jerusalem. Earlier than this, you have this mysterious Habaru people that are mentioned actually during the reign of an earlier pharaoh, Amenhotep IV. This would be about 14th century BC.
Hey Justin, sorry to interrupt you. I'm just getting feedback from the audience that your audio is very crackly, and that's kind of my experience as well. I'm not sure if there's anything you can do about that, but
yeah, I don't know.
Okay.
Could be just the spotty internet here at the hotel.
Okay.
I don't know.
Okay, it's just that there seems to be a bit of feedback or crackle in your microphone, but okay.
Yeah, I've been using this before, and I don't know.
Okay.
I'll do my best. I don't know what else to do.
It's a bit better now, actually. But okay.
It's better now.
Right.
Okay.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
I apologize for that. Hopefully it'll get clear. But I mentioned that there is this reference to this Habaru people, which some scholars I agree with that this is a reference to the ancient Hebrews, but it's debated. The Merneptah's inscription is the most ancient reference that is undisputed. Everyone agrees this is talking about the nation of Israel. That, of course, the Bible tells us their story. Interestingly, dating back to about the 9th century BC, we actually have the first historical image of an Israelite. We have King Jehu. King Jehu, if you go back and read his story in 2 Kings 9 and 10, Jehu the Terminator, he's the one who wipes out, kills like hundreds of the prophets of Baal and their worshippers. We actually have him bowing down to a Assyrian king, Shalmaneser III, and you can see this at the British Museum. I got to go there and see that as well. But I also like to, of course, like to talk about anything in the archaeological evidence of the Old Testament. You have to know about the Tel Dan stela that was discovered in 1993 that has another inscription of victories from this Aramean king talking about his victory on this time over the house of David. So this is our most ancient first historical reference to David outside of the Bible. He also calls him the king of Israel. And this is dated to 850 BC, a little over a century after David's death. And this definitively demonstrates, even to the most skeptical Old Testament scholars, that there was a King David, and he did have at least some form of a kingdom that is indisputable now that the Tel Dan inscription was discovered. What about manuscripts of the Old Testament? The earliest extant Hebrew manuscripts are the Dead Sea Scrolls, which I did, as I mentioned before, I did a talk here on Apologetics Academy a few years back, so you can go check that one out. I did kind of an in-depth history on the Dead Sea Scrolls and why they're such an important discovery for biblical studies. But 230 of the 930 Dead Sea Scrolls that were discovered in those 11 caves near the Dead Sea around 1947 through 1955, 230 of them were biblical scrolls, or at least parts of biblical scrolls, sometimes an entire biblical scroll like the scroll of Isaiah, and most of them dated to 150 to 100 BC, but some even went back, and these would be our oldest, and they go back to the 3rd century BC. Here's one example. This is a portion from Ecclesiastes, or Kohelet in the Hebrew, and this is housed, lo and behold, at the Jordan Museum. So I've taken my students many times to the Jordan Museum to behold. Actually, this is one of 5 Dead Sea Scrolls that is displayed at the Jordan Museum. And you really don't realize how amazing that blessing was until the sad reality recently, if you follow the news about the Bible Museum in Washington and how the Dead Sea Scrolls there, they've all been found to be fake. Fake news when it comes to Dead Sea Scrolls at the Bible Museum in Washington. But in the Jordan Museum, you can behold 5 actual, real, authentic Dead Sea Scrolls. And this particular one is the one from Scripture. This is one from a portion of Ecclesiastes dating to somewhere in the 3rd century BC. I told my students, I'm not just going to teach them the Bible, I'm going to show them the Bible. There's the Bible right there. What about the New Testament? I'm getting down to the earliest evidence that we're heading towards. What about the New Testament? Archaeologically, we have tons and tons, and I'm sure people will come on here and share some of the treasures that we've discovered. We have the tomb of King Herod, incredible. We have that Jesus was born under. We have the tomb of King Herod. We even have the tomb of the high priest Joseph Caiaphas. We even have his bones. We even have some of his bones. Dante, if you've read the Divine Comedy, Dante places Joseph Caiaphas in the 6th realm of hell, and he is eternally being crucified. And so Dante and Virgil walk over him as he is lying on the ground, crucified. And so, incredibly, we know exactly where Caiaphas is. We know where he is in the afterlife, and we know where he is on earth. We have his bones. We might even have the tomb of Peter. We might even have the tomb of Jesus' chief apostle Peter. That's a little bit disputed, but I think many scholars agree that there is good evidence that tomb that is under St. Peter's Basilica, as it was built on top of it, is the actual tomb of Peter. As Jesus said, thou art Peter, and upon this rock I will build my church, and the gates of hell will not overcome it. His bones aren't in that tomb. I've actually been there. I've been to the catacombs that are under St. Peter's Basilica, and they take you to this place where you look through this rock and you see the tomb, maybe the tomb of Peter. But you know where the bones are? You know where Peter's bones are? I found this out when I was there. They are actually in the Pope's quarters. So they've been held in the Pope's quarters. I don't know how long, but from Pope to Pope, they've been holding the bones of St. Peter. And so Pope Francis is probably quarantined right now in his private quarters, and that's where Peter's bones are. They're near him right now, probably. But probably the earliest written evidence of something that the New Testament talks about. There may be some other things with the Caesars, but this is one of the most famous, the Pilate stone, an inscription that dates, that was definitely inscribed sometime contemporary with Jesus, dated to the time of Pilate's governorship, AD 26 to 36. We have a decree from Pontius Pilate that says in this inscription, Pontius Pilate, the prefect of Judea. And interestingly, the inscription above Jesus on the cross, this is Jesus of Nazareth, the King of the Jews. Scholars are virtually unanimous that was actually written above Jesus. And so even though we don't have the physical evidence, that's one of the things that was written at the time when Jesus was still alive, right before he died. That was that is some written evidence that we could point to as well that was during Jesus' life. But when it comes to the New Testament manuscripts, again, we have an embarrassment of riches. We possess almost 6,000 Greek New Testament manuscripts. Many of them, some are still being discovered all over the world right now. My mentor and great friend, Dan Wallace, travels the world and is still discovering some Greek New Testament manuscripts. Among them, the 2 earliest, almost complete New Testaments, just about complete New Testaments. The 2 earliest, one is Codex Vaticanus, again held at the Vatican. Sadly, they won't let you see it. or at least they didn't let me see it. I really tried. I tried to get them to let me see it, but they wouldn't. And then you have, from Egypt, you have Codex Sinaiticus. Codex Sinaiticus, that discovery is another great Indiana Jones-like story, because we actually have a true Indiana Jones of New Testament manuscripts, Constantine von Tischendorf, who actually, just like Indiana Jones, wanted to go and find manuscripts and search, and found some of our greatest treasures of New Testament manuscripts. He actually discovered Sinaiticus at St. Catherine's Monastery in Egypt. And he tells us it was on February 4th, 1859. And we actually have his diary reporting what happened. He says that he saved Sinaiticus from being burned by the monks who had already cast 2 heaps of similar manuscripts into the fire. Now, some question whether Tischendorf was telling the truth there. Maybe he was just telling that to make for a great story. But if it's true, that's absolutely incredible. And he goes on to say that this is the most precious biblical treasure in existence. Here is Codex Sinaiticus, the very Codex Sinaiticus that Tischendorf discovered. It's at the British Library in London, near Jonathan. And there I am with my kids. I'm putting my daughter to sleep as I'm seeking to, trying to read from the Codex Sinaiticus. Incredibly, the manuscript is open to Jonah and Obadiah. I mean, I love Jonah and Obadiah. I mean, I don't want to say anything against them, but I mean, if you're going to have Codex Sinaiticus on display, you open it to somewhere in the New Testament, not Jonah and Obadiah. But that's okay. That's okay. It was great seeing that treasure for sure. Earlier than Sinaiticus, you have about 140 papyri, again from Egypt, papyri manuscripts. These are our earliest, and the earliest of them, so therefore the earliest actual manuscript we have, according to the vast majority of scholars, would be what's called P52. They number the papyri manuscripts P1, P2, P3, all the way up to P40. And then you have P52, which is a 3-inch piece of papyri with 5 verses from the Gospel of John. This is from chapter 18, verses 31 through 33, and parts of verses 37 through 38. As I said, the earliest New Testament manuscript we have thus far, dating somewhere between AD 125 and AD 175. A little bit of debate there. But if it's on the earliest side, if it's on that side of AD 125, and the Gospel of John was written, as most think, somewhere about AD 90, we're talking about 35 years between when John wrote the Gospel of John, the original Gospel of John, and when we have the first manuscript, piece of the manuscript. I mean, we're talking about the ink still wet on John's original Gospel when P52 was being copied. Pretty amazing. We can get even closer, though, to Jesus than P52. A lot closer. That's what I want to show you. I want to show you how close we can get historically to Jesus. And it's found in this pearl of great price in 1 Corinthians 15, verses 3 through 8, which I believe is greater than P52, greater than the Dead Sea Scrolls, greater than all the archaeological discoveries combined, my opinion, but I think it's the greatest discovery. And in the sense, it is a discovery of New Testament scholarship, focusing on this as this pre-Pauline, early creedal tradition, as we'll look at. Here is our earliest physical evidence, or the earliest physical existence of 1 Corinthians 15. So this is from what's called P46. Again, the papyri manuscripts that have most of Paul's letters, not all of them, but it's our earliest representation of Paul's letters that we have, dating around AD 200 is the median date that most scholars get from it. So what I have here, and it's because some of it is damaged on one side, and then it continues at the top, but you see how it's damaged, so we're missing some of it. But right there at the top, if I use there it is. We have right here, this begins the actual creed. If you can't read Greek, I understand, but You see what looks like an O, T, and I. This is the word hati, which means that. That, and then you can see at least like this X. This is the chi, rho, sigma for this is Christos. So this is Christ. Christ died for our sins according, this is kata, like kata Mark, kata Matthew. This is according to the scriptures. And so this is our earliest physical evidence of this creed, which is the earliest testimony of Christianity we have on record. But this creedal tradition on Jesus' death, burial, resurrection, and appearances goes back to, on average, within 5 years of Jesus' death. I'm going to show that in more detail in a little bit. We're talking the early 30s AD. And it is unparalleled. What you have here, I'll put it in English so you can see it clearly, but what you have here is unparalleled in the not just in the New Testament, but really all ancient literature. You don't have a list like this, a catalog of someone appearing to a group of people after death. I mean, this is unparalleled in all ancient literature. And just talking about why it's such an irreplaceable treasure, why it's the pearl of great price, even if nothing else had survived, if this had been our New Testament right here, just these 5 verses, if this was our New Testament, this is what we read every Sunday, this is what we memorized, this is what we studied in the original language. If we had only this, we would still have the essence of the gospel. We would have the historical bedrock on which Christianity stands, which is, of course, the death and the resurrection of Jesus, that he died for our sins and that he rose again on the 3rd day. So let me just read it, this most ancient testimony, and that's what I have here. I have just the most ancient testimony that Paul is quoting in 1 Corinthians 15, in the early part of 1 Corinthians 15. It says, Christ died for our sins according to the scriptures. He was buried, and he was raised on the 3rd day according to the scriptures. And then he appeared to Cephas, which is the Aramaic for Peter. So this is Peter, but this is just the Aramaic. This is the actual name that Jesus would have given Peter if he spoke in Aramaic. Cephas means rock. Petros means rock. Peter means rock. And he appeared to Cephas. He appeared to the 12. And after that, he appeared to more than 500 brothers and probably sisters, you should translate, at one time, most of whom remain until now, but some have fallen asleep. Then he appeared to James. This would be the brother of Jesus. Then to all the apostles. And last of all, he appeared to me also, as to one abnormally born. Now, verse 8, scholars unanimously would say Paul has now added himself to this ancient creed. So Paul is quoting this creed, and then he puts himself as the last of these people, beginning with probably Mary Magdalene, but also Peter, that Jesus appeared to, and Paul was last of all. Paul was the last person that the actual physically raised Jesus appeared to. But first, let's talk about why virtually all scholars agree that this creedal statement was formulated on average within 5 years after the crucifixion. Remember, Paul says right here, you just have to look it up, but in verse 3, right as he introduces this, he says, what I received, I passed on to you, I delivered unto you. What is of first importance? And then he says that Christ died for us. And so he begins it with this, what I received and what I delivered. And this language of received and delivered, this is a very Jewish way of referring to the transmission of tradition. We see this in the Mishnah. We see this in many other places. We see this in Josephus. But Paul is referring to the fact that he is transmitting tradition that he himself received at some point before the planting of the church at Corinth. And then he delivered this tradition, what we call a creedal tradition, to the church at Corinth. He delivered other things as well. If you read through 1 Corinthians, you see some hymns to Christ he might have received earlier and delivered to them. The account of the Lord's Supper. On the night he was betrayed, he broke bread and said, "This is my body." He took the cup and said, "This is my blood." So that right there, again, is something that he received and he delivered unto the Corinthians. So Paul received this creed sometime before the planting of the church at Corinth, and we date that somewhere between 49, 50 AD. Somewhere right around there is when Paul would have planted the church at Corinth. But when? How early did he receive it? And from whom? Who did he get this irreplaceable treasure from? Most scholars point back to Galatians 1, which is the beginning, along with Galatians 2, of this kind of bedrock autobiography of Paul. We have Paul laying out what his movement was, what he did after Jesus appeared to him on the Damascus Road. And he lays out really chronologically how many years it took to do this and where he went and what he did. And specifically, we see this information is most important in Galatians 1, 18 through 19. This is in Galatians 1, 18 through 19. He says, then 3 years later, this would be 3 years after his conversion, after Jesus appeared to him, I went up to Jerusalem. This is the first time Paul went to Jerusalem. And this would have been around 37 AD. 37 AD is roughly the date that most scholars would agree on. To become acquainted again with Cephas, this would be Peter, and stayed with him 15 days. But I did not see any other of the apostles except James, the Lord's brother. So Galatians 1 and 2 is full of very important information, but that right there, again, would be the pearl of that information in Galatians 1 through 2. I have an entire chapter in my upcoming book on this epic meeting, this 15 days where Paul was a house guest with Peter. I mean, here we're looking at probably the two greatest figures, not probably, the two greatest figures after Jesus in all of church history, Paul and Peter. And they spent 2 weeks together in Jerusalem in AD 37, within about 5 years after Jesus' death. Again, a bedrock fact. Nobody disputes that Paul spent this time with Peter in Jerusalem is undisputed. And so what I like to think about is, what did they talk about? What did they talk about? One scholar put it this way: they didn't spend all their time talking about the weather. They didn't spend all their time talking about the weather or sports or the Olympics or anything else. You know they were talking about Jesus. You know they were talking about Jesus. Paul probably wanted to know everything he could learn from the chief disciple of Jesus, who spent 3 years with him, of this man that he first met when he appeared to him in his resurrected body on the Damascus Road. An incredible meeting, an incredible fact that they spent 2 weeks together. And Paul also met with James, of course. We can't downplay that. He's meeting with James, the brother of Jesus. He probably wanted to know, what was Jesus' upbringing like? What was it like being the brother of Jesus, growing up with him? I'm sure he learned a ton from James as well. And like I said, we are getting so close to the historical Jesus here. We are just from Paul to James to Jesus, or from Paul to Peter to Jesus. We are the hands that embrace Paul embrace the historical Jesus. And I like what Bart Ehrman says in his book reviewing the mythicists and did Jesus exist? He says, so in the letter to the Galatians, Paul states as clearly as possible that he knew Jesus' brother. Can we get any closer to an eyewitness report than this? Paul knows one of these brothers personally. It is hard to get much closer to the historical Jesus than that. Yeah. Other than Jesus actually writing something and us having that, this is about as good as you can ask for an ancient historical figure to know, to have direct information relayed to you from their chief disciple and from their brother. And that's what we have in Paul. And it was at this meeting in AD 37 in Jerusalem. This is where most scholars agree he would receive many traditions and a lot of information about Jesus, but specifically this creedal tradition in 1 Corinthians 15. I mean, it makes the most sense. Notice in the tradition, you have, he appeared to Cephas. He appeared to James. Where did he learn that? Where did he learn that information? It makes the most sense that he learned it when he met with Peter for the first time, and he met with James for the first time. So this is probably the most likely place that Paul would have gotten this information. So Paul received the creedal tradition that he delivered to the Corinthians around AD 50. If he received it in 37 AD, then that means the tradition had to have been formulated earlier than that. So how early can we go with this tradition? Here's some scholars who've gone into depth in their books on this. And Gerd Ludemann is an atheist New Testament scholar. He says, we can assume that all the elements in the tradition are to be dated to the first 2 years after the crucifixion of Jesus. So he puts it at within 2 years. Within 2 years of Jesus' death, this, what we read earlier, Christ died for our sins, was buried, rose again, he appeared to all these people. This was put together within about 2 years of Jesus' death. But I think James Dunn, a New Testament scholar, nails it. This tradition, we can be entirely confident, was formulated as tradition within months of Jesus' death. I think that is the most likely amount of time. Probably soon after Pentecost, the experience of Pentecost and Jesus' ascension. Soon after that, the apostles went out and they, planting churches, making disciples of all nations, they would teach their new converts this bedrock teaching of what is the essence of their faith, what is the essence of the gospel, what Jesus accomplished at the cross and in his resurrection. And here's proof, here's evidence. We can summon a group of witnesses, individuals and groups, and even someone like Paul, who was an enemy. This is another way to look at it. When you think of sources for Jesus, many just think that our sources for Jesus are the Gospels. And of course, we have an embarrassment of riches in the Gospels. But Paul's letters, especially his early letters, were written about 10 to 15 years before the first Gospel, Mark, was written. So we can go back to the early 50s AD, late 40s AD with Paul's letters. But then Paul, within those letters, as we're saying, quotes creedal traditions like 1 Corinthians 15, hymns, Christological hymns praising Jesus as clearly divine, like Philippians 2, for example, who being in the very nature God did not consider equality with God something to be grasped, but made himself nothing, humbled himself even to death on a cross, but God raised him up. That hymn, scholars are almost unanimous, dates to within a decade of Jesus' death. That's something Paul is quoting that he received again. That goes back probably a decade earlier, well, at least almost 2 decades earlier from when he wrote Philippians. And we also have it, as you see, the 1 Corinthians 11, 23 through 25 is the account of the Lord's Supper. But there are many more examples than this of these creedal traditions and statements of the resurrection and things that scholars have sifted out of Paul's letters that probably go back to the first decade. And like the creedal tradition, most agree within about the first 5 years of Jesus's death. Therefore, the statement of Jesus's death for our sins, burial, resurrection, and all these appearances to individuals and groups was being proclaimed in the early 30s AD, beginning in Jerusalem, and it was formulated. How could it not have been by Peter, James, John, probably others of the 12? I mean, who would have formulated this if not them that early? Who had the authority? Who were the main leaders of the church at that time? It would have been these original followers of Jesus. And as I said, this was probably like a catechism. It probably was a memorizable way of telling the story of Jesus. Probably many stories and narratives came to their mind as they said each one, like Christ died. They probably thought of all the things that we read about in the Gospels, of what Jesus went through as he went before Pilate and was crucified. And when he was buried, they probably thought of the story of Joseph of Arimathea and how he buried him and how the women found the tomb on the third day. It's even mentioned in the Creed that he was found, the tomb was found empty on the third day, and that he rose again and that he appeared to all these people. And we get some of those stories as well in the Gospels, the stories of Jesus appearing. So we see that this creedal tradition really is the foundation, not only of the passion narratives of the Gospels, I actually have a chart in my book where I put the statement of the creedal tradition side by side, not just with the endings of all four gospels. So you have the story of Christ's death, you have the story of Christ's burial, you have the story of Christ's resurrection, you have the story of his appearances, but also in the sermons in Acts. If you go to the sermons in Acts, especially Acts 10 and Acts 13, you see that the apostles follow this same model. They talk about Christ's death, they talk about how he was buried, they talk about his resurrection, and then they talk about how he appeared to me. He appeared to a number of people over this certain period of time in Galilee and in Jerusalem. So we see this creedal tradition truly the bedrock of all that goes forth afterwards. The sermons in Acts and the narratives, the narrative of the passion account of Jesus in the Gospels. So what I do in my book is I then, after I really lay this out as the bedrock source of Christianity, I then say, okay, now let's look at what are the bedrock facts that we gain, that we learn from this bedrock source about Jesus and about the earliest followers. And I don't have time to go through all the different bedrock facts that we learned, but I thought I'll focus on one. I'll focus on a very significant one, and that would be the appearances. The appearances of Jesus. According to this creedal tradition, dating again within 5 years or so of Jesus' death, Jesus appeared to multiple groups and individuals, believers, and at least one, for sure, unbeliever, even an enemy, Paul. And this would be the list of Jesus' appearances in the New Testament as a whole. So this would be in Paul's letters, the Gospels, and Acts. This is all the appearances of Jesus that we have on record. I'm sure it's an incomplete list. I'm sure Jesus appeared to many more people during that 40-day period, as the book of Acts tells us he did it over a 40-day period. But we get 12 distinct, some of these might overlap, but 12 distinct stories or references to Jesus's resurrection appearances. We have 4 individual appearances. We have his appearance to Mary Magdalene first. He appeared to her first, according to all 4 of the Gospels. We have Peter, his chief disciple. We have James, his brother. And we have, again, Paul, the last one, but Paul, uniquely someone who is actively fighting against Jesus, actively fighting against his movement, wanting to destroy it by his own testimony. Then we have 8 groups of people. So we have the group of women. We're told that Jesus appeared to Mary Magdalene by herself, but also appeared to them as a group. We're told he appeared to the 2 on the Emmaus Road in Luke 24. He appeared to the 12. He appeared to more than 500, probably men and women, at once. He appeared to 7 at the Sea of Tiberias at the end of John, in the Gospel of John, chapter 21. He appeared to the 11 on the mountain, probably more in the audience there too, but the Mountain of Galilee, recorded in Matthew 28. And he appeared to all the apostles, as it says in 1 Corinthians 15, which I argue, and many argue, is probably the ascension. So this is probably referring to the ascension, where we're told in Acts, it was about 120 people who were there at the Mount of Olives when Jesus ascended into heaven, and they saw him there. But if that is not the same appearance, then you actually have about 13 distinct appearances. But notice in 1 Corinthians 5, in 1 Corinthians 15, 5 through 8, we get 6 of those 12 already. So in this earliest creed that goes back to within about 5 years of Jesus' death, we already have half of the resurrection appearances in the New Testament testified to. So as you continue on in the New Testament, the 4 Gospels and Acts, we only gain 6 more resurrection appearances. And as I said, some of them might overlap. The more than 500 appearance may be the Matthew 28 appearance, for example. And the apostles' appearance, as I said, may be the ascension. And there's only one more resurrection appearance that has the agreement of virtually all scholars. Now again, when I say that all scholars like Bart Ehrman, atheist scholars, Jewish scholars, even non-believing scholars agree on these appearances, what I'm saying is that they believe that these people believe Jesus appeared to them. that it's a historical fact that they believed it. They obviously don't believe Jesus actually appeared to them. They don't believe Jesus rose from the dead and appeared to them, but they do believe that Peter believed Jesus appeared to them, that the 12 believed Jesus appeared to them. And the only other one of this list of 12 that you get beyond the ones from 1 Corinthians 15 is the appearance to Mary Magdalene. Interestingly, Mary Magdalene, that appearance is virtually agreed upon by all, that the reason why she shows up in all these traditions is because she actually believed Jesus appeared to her. Bart Ehrman summarizes it this way in his book, How Jesus Became God. He says, my tentative suggestion is that 3 or 4 people, though possibly more, had visions of Jesus sometime after he died. One of these was almost certainly Peter, since reports about his seeing Jesus are found everywhere in our sources, including our earliest record of Paul in 1 Corinthians 15:5. And it needs to be remembered that Paul actually knew Peter. Paul, too, explicitly states that he had a vision of Jesus, and I think we can take him at his word that he believes Jesus appeared to him. It is also significant that Mary Magdalene enjoys such prominence in all the gospel resurrection narratives, even though she is virtually absent everywhere else in the Gospels. She is mentioned in only one passage in the entire New Testament in connection with Jesus during his public ministry, in Luke 8. And yet she is always the first to announce that Jesus has been raised. Why is this? One plausible explanation is that she too had a vision of Jesus after he died. So if you add Mary Magdalene, you have 4 individuals that virtually all scholars agree believed Jesus appeared to them. Bart Ehrman actually doubts the appearance to the 500. So if you look at the 1 Corinthians 15 appearances, he agrees with all the others. He agrees with Mary Magdalene. He agrees with Peter. He agrees with the 12. He agrees with James. He agrees with Paul. The apostles, because it's just too ambiguous, we don't know specifically what that is probably referring to. I think it's probably referring to the ascension, but because it just says to all the apostles, we don't know exactly what that's referring to. That one he could set aside. But the 500 one is interesting when you read what he says about that one, because he can't deny that it's in this bedrock source, that it's testified to as early as within a few years. He argues even like within 3 years or so after Jesus' death. But you know what it is that makes him doubt the 500 appearance? Because it's so fantastic. It's so remarkable. It's just too good to be true. It's incredible that we have a testimony that over 500 people saw Jesus at once. And I think there really is, as he says, actually, when he discusses it, he says, if it's true, there's a certain force to this argument. Yes, there is a certain force to this argument. There is a strong force to this argument. If 500 people did believe that Jesus appeared to them, and we can know that as sure as anything we can know historically, and I think we can. We also see Paul's apologetic really coming out here, and that's why he's bringing up the appearances, really to demonstrate that Jesus did rise. He rose from the dead. Evidence. Look at all these people who appeared to him, who he appeared to, including me. But look at the 500, he says. Many of them are still alive. So he says, he's writing to the Corinthians about 20 years after these appearances. And he says, many of them are still alive, though some have fallen asleep. Now, why would he say that? Clearly, he expects the Corinthians, some of them might travel to Jerusalem, and he's saying, hey, you could go meet with them. You could go learn what it was to see the risen Jesus. Some of them are still alive, and maybe some of them even traveled to Corinth. We know Peter traveled to Corinth. We know people from James in Jerusalem traveled to Corinth. Paul traveled to Corinth. So it's very, very likely that there was this a lot of traveling between these people who had witnessed the resurrection of Jesus, even some of the 500. And Paul, for him to say that, he has to have known him. He's not lying. Bart Ehrman agreed. Paul's not lying. Paul believes that some of them are still alive. How does he know that? How does he know that some of them are still alive? Probably when he was in Jerusalem, he met some of these people and learned about this appearance, just like he learned about the appearance to Peter and the appearance to James. So to this day, the only answer really that's given, other than I don't know what happened, to explain these resurrection appearances is that they were hallucinations. This is still, even Bart Ehrman, this was his main answer to the resurrection appearances, and at least Jesus Interrupted, and and other earlier books, but like in when Jesus became God, how Jesus became God. Now he goes with kind of this cautious agnostic approach. I just don't know what happened. Let's just leave it there. We know that they believe Jesus appeared to them. Believers would say Jesus actually appeared to them. I would say, I don't know. So he goes now more with the I don't know. But hallucination still would be pretty much the only answer that people give. Now, Dale Allison, another excellent New Testament scholar, I have his book actually right here near my elbow. Dale Allison, in The Resurrecting Jesus, one of the best books. You know, I read a lot of books on the resurrection of Jesus really over the last 20 years, but especially in preparation for my book. So I can tell you it's one of the best out there, The Resurrecting Jesus. And Dale Allison does about a 20-page survey of the vast literature on hallucinations, on people who believed a dead loved one or somebody had appeared to them from different cultures, from a psychological standpoint, historical standpoint. I mean, he really does an excellent job laying things out. And when you really look at his research and what he lays out, you find how absolutely unique Jesus' resurrection appearances are when you compare it to the literature on hallucinations. Here's some examples that you gain the fruit from Dale Allison's labor. Hallucinations are rarely seen by multiple individuals and groups over an extended period of time. So there may be some examples, but it's rare. It's a very rare thing to have that testimony in the literature on hallucinations. Hallucinations are not seen at all. I looked at some of the actual the primary sources that he was looking at here. No groups over 4 to 8 people. 4 to 8 people would be the max that you have claiming together that they're seeing some sort of apparition or a ghost or or a dead loved one or something like that. You don't have more than 4 to 8 people at once saying that. Hallucinations have never led to the claim that a dead person has been resurrected. So nobody had a hallucination and then said, you know, I think that person rose from the dead. I think we should go check out his tomb. We should go look at the graveyard. You know, it's probably going to be opened. Never happened. Hallucinations don't involve a person's enemy. So you don't have people who hallucinate someone that they hate, someone that they want to be dead. You know, that they just hate, that's their enemy. You don't have that. And then, you know, rarely do you have a hallucination launch a world movement or religion. That rarely happens as well. And so in all of these cases, these rare cases, if they even show up in the literature, all of those happen in the case of Jesus. All of those happen with the resurrection appearances of Jesus. So the resurrection appearances are hallucinations. They're unlike anything we have on record. They're absolutely unique. And Dale Allison summarizes his discussion this way. He says, these appear to be the facts, and they raise the question of how we should explain them. The apologists for the faith say that the sightings of Jesus must, given the reports, have been objective. One person can hallucinate, but 12 at the same time, and dozens over an extended period of time. These are legitimate questions, and waving the magical wand of mass hysteria will not make them vanish. And if you read Dale Allison, you know he's not a fundamentalist. He's very skeptical on a lot of things. He does an excellent job, I think, of laying out what we can know for sure and what we can be skeptical about. Lastly, on the appearances, this is one of my favorites from Dr. Paula Friedrichsen, another New Testament scholar, also an agnostic, not a believer. She says, talking about the appearances of Jesus, she says, I know in their own terms what they saw was the raised Jesus. That's what they say. And then all the historic evidence we have, afterwards attest to their conviction that that's what they saw. I'm not saying that they really did see the raised Jesus. I wasn't there. I don't know what they saw. But I do know that as a historian, they must have seen something. They must have seen something. Yes. Dr. Paula Friedrichsen, I'd like to ask you, what did they see? What did they see? Whatever it was, there's no doubt, it transformed their lives to the point, at least some of them, of suffering and dying for that belief. I believe those eyewitnesses that have their throats cut, they usually are the more trustworthy ones. Because interestingly, we do have strong historical evidence that those same three, the three in the original creed, Peter, Jesus' chief disciple, James, his brother, and Paul, his enemy, we have strong historical evidence. We don't have strong historical evidence for the deaths of all the apostles and other early Christians. But for those three in particular, we have very strong historical evidence that convinces skeptics like even Ehrman that they did die for their faith, that they did die believing in the resurrection. They died confessing Jesus as Lord. Whatever it was that they saw, Peter, James, Paul, it was worth giving their lives for. We know they believed Jesus appeared to them, and we know they died believing. So what did they see? I think a good question to ask your skeptical friends and your unbelieving neighbors as we lead up to Easter in a loving and humble way. Talk to them about these claims of the original followers of Jesus and ask them, what did they see? What did they see? What drove Paul to be stoned and whipped and imprisoned and travel across the Roman Empire to proclaim this Jesus as Lord of the world? What? He could have quit at any point, like one of his disciples Demas did, and went to Vegas and said, "Forget this, I'm done with this." Paul could have done that at any moment. He didn't. We know he went to his death believing it. Why? What did he see? And I think it's important to close beyond the first century with the fact that Jesus didn't just stop transforming lives with Mary and Peter and James and Paul. A lot of times we stop there and act like Jesus did a bunch of stuff back then, but he hasn't done anything since. Billions upon billions claim to be transformed to this day by the risen Jesus. There are almost a third of the world that at least professes to believe in Jesus, that professes to have a daily experience with Jesus. In fact, I have a lecture that I've been giving that was kind of inspired by some of the arguments in my book. But I have a lecture where I show how people all over the world, on almost every continent over the last 2,000 years, has been at least claiming to experience the risen Jesus. Now, it's not the same as the resurrection appearances, but it's still some sort of vision or dream or hearing his voice, something where they were convinced that crucified Jewish carpenter from 2,000 years ago, they were convinced from all different parts of the world that he was the one speaking to them, that he was the one appearing to them. And then their lives were changed, and they actually made the world better. These aren't just random people on the streets. I'm talking about some of the most famous people and most influential people who've ever lived. People like Martin Luther King Jr. Martin Luther King Jr. is the last one I talk about, actually. He actually almost quit the civil rights movement early on in his ministry. Many people don't know this. It's in his autobiography. But he believed that he heard the voice of Jesus when he prayed one night, saying he was going to quit because he was receiving all these threats to him and his family. But he believed he heard the voice of Jesus. And he said, "I experienced the divine like I had never experienced before. And after that, I was ready to face anything." So everybody loves Martin Luther King, as we should. People of other religions, people who are not believers, they love Martin Luther King. What gave him such courage? What gave him such power? He said it was Jesus. Ultimately, he believed the risen Jesus spoke to him. That's just one of many examples that I give. But I also say at the end, can other religions claim that? Could any other religion do that? Could any other religion, Hindu, Buddhist, Muslim, Mormon, could they point to people from every continent on the planet for thousands of years, influential people who have influenced the world, that claim that they were transformed by their faith? No, they cannot. No, they cannot. I throw the gauntlet down to see if anybody could do that. And here's something to think about. I'll close with these questions. Muslims and Hindus, for example, predominantly, but it happens with others too, but report having dreams and visions of Jesus in many different countries across, especially Africa and Asia. These are well documented, independent, and surprisingly very similar in most cases of what they say they saw in their dreams or their visions and what Jesus said to them. Usually something from Scripture. He usually says something like, I am the way and the truth and the life, something from Scripture. And I've actually met some of them while I've been in the Middle East. I've actually talked to, and I'm absolutely convinced that they did believe that Jesus spoke to them, and really incredible testimonies. So here's the question. Why don't Christians ever have dreams of Krishna or Buddha and then convert to those religions? Why doesn't that happen? Why don't Hindus ever have dreams of Buddha? Why don't Muslims ever have dreams of Krishna or Buddha or Joseph Smith? I mean, when has a Muslim ever had a dream and then woke up and said, Mormonism is true? It's never happened, by the way. Never happened. But countless numbers of all faiths and non-faiths are being transformed by Jesus Christ all over the world to this very day. So my message this Easter, as I hope your message is too, is the same as the apostles in the 30s AD Jerusalem, that Christ is risen. Therefore, get up, take up your cross, deny yourself, and follow him. The living Christ is still summoning us all to follow him. This Jesus God raised up again, to which we are all witnesses. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Dr. Bass. Okay, so folks, this is the interactive portion of the program. If you'd like to talk to Dr. Bass on Zoom, you can raise your hand and I'll promote you to panelist, or you can also ask a question in text form by submitting it via the Q&A button. If you're on the YouTube live stream, you can simply enter a question into the chat box and I'll put it to Dr. Bass. I had a few questions actually.
Did my sound get better, by the way?
It was a bit crackly. We could make out what you were saying. It was just there was a lot of static in the background.
Yeah, it's unfortunate.
Yeah. So one of my concerns about placing a lot of Christians like to place the entire case for the resurrection on 1 Corinthians 15, 3-8. And I have a few concerns about that approach because I personally think that you need the Gospels and Acts as well. And I know you in your presentation drew from the Gospels and Acts as well in making your case.
Yeah, I would say it's the best case to begin with, but not the only case. I would definitely bring in everything.
Sure.
If I had the time and I could do a whole series, but if I could only do one lecture, this is where I would focus.
Sure. I think that the dating of 1 Corinthians 15 based upon Galatians 1 is what I would probably class as intelligent speculation, right? We don't really know exactly when Paul received this creed. It's most probable that he received it upon his visit to Jerusalem, as recounted in Galatians 1, 2 years after his conversion. But we don't know that for sure. So how much weight would you place on that argument?
Well, yeah, I agree. I mean, what we can say definitively is it was before he planted the church in Corinth. So we're looking at, no matter what, it's within that first 2 decades of the church. But I think what I do find amazing is even among the most skeptical scholars, nobody even says it's in the 40s AD, which they could easily say. Most agree because of that meeting, because Paul met with James and he met with Peter, that's the most likely place that he would have learned for the first time. Because, I mean, it doesn't make sense to me that he would meet with them in 37 AD, sometime in the 30s, and then learn with them the next meeting in the 40s that Jesus appeared to him and Jesus appeared to James. I mean, it makes the most sense that he learned that information when he first met them, and that would mean that he got this creedal tradition at that early stage. But yeah, I mean, when we deal with some of these things, certainty is a fuzzy word. But I would say it's as strong as that Paul wrote Galatians. It's as strong as that Paul's movements in Galatians that he testifies to, that he actually did those things, that he went to meet with Peter. I think it's as strong as that.
Okay. In my own arguments, when I do debates and I talk about 1 Corinthians 15, I think a stronger argument to rest upon when it comes to this text is when you get to verse 7 through 11, He says, then he appeared to James and told the apostles as to one timely born, he appeared also to me. And in verse 9, for I am the least of the apostles, unworthy to be called an apostle, because I persecuted the church of God. But with the grace of God, I am what I am, and his grace toward me was not in vain. On the contrary, I worked harder than any of them, though it was not I, but the grace of God that is with me. Whether then it was I or they, so we preach, and so he believed. And so he thus assumes that his proclamation of the resurrection is consistent with what's already been proclaimed to them by the Jerusalem eldership, in particular Peter and James and the 12. And we already know independently that Peter had visited Corinth and preached there, because in 1 Corinthians 1, Paul chides the Corinthian church for having divisions and factions in their midst. Some say, I follow Cephas, others I follow Paul, others I follow Apollos, others I follow Christ. And Paul says, guys, we're all on the same team here, right?
Exactly. And that's why I think they could have traveled to Jerusalem, even from Corinth, to meet with like the 500 who were still alive.
Mm-hmm. And so even independent of that argument about the dating of 1 Corinthians 15, which I think is not conclusive, you can nonetheless demonstrate that what Paul, the beliefs that Paul summarizes in this creedal tradition that he passes on in 1 Corinthians 15 is consistent with the beliefs of the Jerusalem eldership, in particular Peter and James. Definitely. And so it becomes like a mute point exactly when you receive this creed, because all you need to show is that's what the Jerusalem church believed, that's what Peter believed, that's what James believed, that's what the 12 believed.
Yeah, I completely agree. I think it is very significant and important if we know for sure what they were proclaiming in those early 30s time frame in Jerusalem. If we know, and I think we do, that they were proclaiming that's mm-hmm. everything.
It also seems to me I'm not so convinced that 1 Corinthians 15 is our earliest source. I think that an even earlier source is Peter's speech in Acts chapter 2, which was delivered at Pentecost, some 50 days after Jesus' death and resurrection. And it seems if we're able to speculate or make intelligent speculation about when Paul received that creed, when that creed must have been received by Paul, when it must have been written down, then why can we not similarly make intelligent speculation about when that sermon must have taken place? And therefore that would make Acts 2, Peter's sermon, an even earlier source, right?
Yeah, I would agree with you on that. I think what we're setting aside, though, of course, is the Acts sermons and the Acts testimonies are not accepted as historical. I mean, Bart Ehrman would not accept that Peter probably, he would accept Peter probably said something, but he probably wouldn't accept that speech is not just Bart Ehrman, but most of the more liberal side scholars who, Henschen, who wrote his commentary on Acts, and those guys, what's his name? Starts with a P. Forgot his name. Purvo. Yeah, Purvo. Those guys. I mean, they would say, Luke's just, inventing the speech in the 80s AD, and so I agree with you because I think it's historical. But I think when we're dealing with, which is one of the goals of my book, is I'm only dealing with things that are unanimously agreed upon. But I agree with you. But it's interesting, even in those sermons like Acts 2. You do see how the creed, even if it might have been formulated soon after that sermon was delivered, it's clear that this is the apostolic proclamation. This is the order to go. They talk about the cross, they talk about the burial, they talk about the resurrection, then they talk about the appearances, and that it's according to Scripture. They always, talk about how to fulfill these certain prophecies. Hmm. So you still see the creedal tradition, even if it was chronologically maybe a little after that.
So, I mean, when we study the Book of Acts, and there's some very good commentaries on this, Greg Keener, as you know, wrote a 4-volume commentary set, and Colin Hemer before him wrote a book on called The Book of Acts and the Setting of Hellenistic History, and there's some excellent monographs on the topic of just the sheer accuracy of Luke as a historian, especially in the Book of Acts.
And I agree with that.
Yeah. And so it makes, I think, an inductive argument for supposing that that Luke is really reliable, that he's habitually truthful. And we also know, because Luke represents himself as a traveling companion of Paul, because he uses these plural pronouns.
I think he had access to Peter. I think he probably talked to Peter.
Exactly. And so he was a traveling companion of Paul. I think not only do we have his own testimony from the we statements, which I think is best interpreted as a claim to be a traveling companion, but I think we also have an evidence for that in terms of extra biblical corroborations of little points of detail that he gets right that it would be otherwise difficult to know. and also undesigned coincidences relating to the Book of Acts with the letters of Paul. And we, in particular, have good evidence that Luke was with Paul in Jerusalem in Acts 21. When he went into the elders of Jerusalem, and all the elders are present, including James.
He had access to James.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. And then he gets imprisoned in Caesarea for 2 years with Paul. And Caesarea is quite close to Jerusalem geographically. And so he would have had, that access to Peter. And there's very good evidence for the shipwreck, for Luke's presence on that shipwreck in Acts 27 with Paul on the way to Rome. And so if Luke was present with Paul on that shipwreck to Rome, then that presupposes that he must have been with him at the start point of that journey, which was in Caesarea. And so that, I think, authenticates his presence in Jerusalem with Paul in Acts 21 and his access to the Jerusalem apostles. And so it seems that Luke had access to the Jerusalem apostles for an extended period of time, and therefore was in a position to know what their claim was concerning the resurrection of Jesus. And so if Luke is representing Peter to have believed in the resurrection of Jesus at his speech in Acts 2, that I think is quite good evidence that indeed is historical, that's indeed what Peter was proclaiming. Even if the exact words are not original with Peter, the content surely is.
Yeah, that's the gist of it.
Mm-hmm.
I completely agree with you, but I think, that this is the great job that you and I and others have to convince people like Purvo and Henshin and Ehrman and all those who are skeptical of this. But see, I like to bypass all this, at least when I'm doing, trying to convince and debate, similar to what Jesus did with the Sadducees. Jesus quotes from the books that the Sadducees agree on, and then they have common ground with. He doesn't try to convince them that Isaiah is the word of God or Daniel's the word of God. He just goes straight to what they agree on. So I like that method, and we see the apologists in the early church doing that. So I like to focus on what's bedrock, where we all agree to make the case. But I agree, if I write, God willing, I'll write books on the Gospels and Acts, and I'll be making those exact same arguments. And hopefully we can bring all of them on the other side.
Well, Richard Purvo was already convinced. He died a few years ago. So. Well, he was very aptly named, as I'm sure you know as well. With his, yeah. Okay. Okay. So another one I had. Another concern I have about the amount of weight that people put on the 1 Corinthians 15 argument among the arsenal of apologetic arguments for the resurrection is that if we limit ourselves to 1 Corinthians 15, which I know you didn't do in your presentation, but for, a lot of people try to advocate for doing this, like Ari Habermas and sometimes Michael Licona and others. And a concern I have is that the 1 Corinthians 15 on its own is not sufficient grounds for evaluating the rationality of the disciples' beliefs on the resurrection, because we're not told about the nature of those resurrection encounters. What we have in the Gospels and Acts is an indication that the appearances were polymodal in character, or multisensory, involving multiple sensory modes, not just sight, but group conversations with Jesus, eating breakfast with Jesus on the shore of the Sea of Galilee, physical contact with Jesus, and so forth. And according to Acts 1, it was extended across 40 days, so it wasn't just one brief and confusing episode. But with 1 Corinthians 15, you only have the appearances without any indication as to the nature of those appearances. It seems to me that the appearances described in 1 Corinthians 15 are also consistent with the objective vision hypothesis, which, as far as I understand, by the way, is the view that Dale Allison takes. I don't think Dale Allison entertains a physical resurrection hypothesis.
Well, it seems to me that I'd have to go back, but I think because I think that the argument against that, the spiritual visions, is the word resurrection itself, as you know. N.T. Wright, I think, makes that strong argument in his first 200 pages of his Resurrection of the Son of God, that resurrection, that means, as 1 Corinthians 15 lays out, when you look at the rest of the chapter, we're talking about physical, something happening to the corpse. But on your point about the not knowing the nature of the appearances, I think that's a good point. And I think I'm so thankful that we have the embarrassment of riches that we have. We have the Gospels. We have these detailed accounts, which I think are really the narrative form of, like, we have, he appeared to the 12, and then we have the narrative in Luke and in John of what it looked like when he appeared to the 12. He came upon them and said, "Peace be among you," and things. But I still would say if we just had Paul's letters, just had the early letters of Paul and that testimony in 1 Corinthians 15, we would still have enough, though, to melt our hearts, to want to follow Jesus, and to know that he died for our sins, that he loved us, and he gave himself for us. We would have the hymn in Philippians 2, that he was God forever, and he humbled himself, and he came down and died on a cross and then rose from the dead. And so I think we would have all that beauty and essence of the gospel and that love that draws us just in Paul's letters alone. But of course, as you say, we have so much more because we have the gospels. I agree. But I do think we have enough just with 1 Corinthians 15 and Paul's story surrounding it in the early letters.
Okay. But couldn't the 1 Corinthians 15 evidence and the evidence from Paul's letters be consistent with disembodied Jesus that appears very quickly for or just appears to speak a few words or something of that nature? It seems that with just the 1 Corinthians 15 passage, it seems that it's difficult to adjudicate the rationality of the disciples' beliefs that Jesus rose from the dead, right?
I don't think so, because Paul compares Jesus's resurrection with our future resurrection. Mm-hmm. Paul's a Pharisee, so he believes in, there's no doubt, future physical resurrection of everyone. And so when he compares, just as we will be raised, so was Jesus raised. So I think that, like what happened to Jesus's mortal body is what's going to happen to our mortal bodies, Philippians 3. And so I think we have that testimony from Paul very clearly that he believed in physical resurrection. So when he says on the third day he was raised, he has to be talking about physical resurrection.
Okay. How do you respond to the objection, which I've often come across, that 1 Corinthians 15 does not draw a qualitative distinction between Paul's experience and that of the apostles? So we know that Paul's experience, as per Acts 9, was qualitatively different from the other apostles. But how would we justify that view just from Paul's letters?
That it's different? You're saying? Well, I don't think it's different. I don't think it's different in the sense that I think what's unique about Paul and the others is that Jesus himself, in his glorified body, appeared to them. So it's not like I was talking about the Hindus and Muslims who've had visions and dreams of Jesus. That's different. What happened in Nabil Qureshi is different than what happened to Paul and what happened to the original followers. They actually had the physical resurrection of Jesus. Now, I think the appearance of Jesus coming down from heaven to Paul was clearly this like body of light, and he was like probably this similar to the way he was in Revelation 1 when John goes up to heaven and he sees the glorified Jesus and he falls at his feet as though dead. Similar, Paul falls at his feet and is blinded by this light. But I still think it's telling us, and I think Paul putting himself in that line is saying, the same way that Jesus appeared to them, he appeared to me. The key difference is because it was post-ascension, he was this body of light and in glory when he appeared to them, not, the way with the other disciples where, they didn't even recognize him for a while.
Okay. There's a couple questions in the chat on YouTube, on the YouTube live stream. Ken McCracken says, doesn't Peter talk about the resurrection in 1 Peter 1, 20 and 21?
Yes. Again, so Peter testified. Even if you look at 2 Peter, Peter testifies to the transfiguration, things like that. But again, scholars like Bart Ehrman, more skeptical, liberal scholars don't think Peter wrote 1 Peter or 2 Peter. There are more that accept 1 Peter. You do have some more moderate to liberal scholars that accept Peter wrote 1 Peter. But and I talk about this in the book, that the only books that we have kind of unanimous across the board testimony that this author wrote these books is those 7 letters of Paul, what are called the 7 undisputed letters. And this would be 1st and 2nd Corinthians, Romans, 1st Thessalonians, Philemon, Philippians, and Galatians. So those 7, nobody disputes that Paul wrote those, and that the information in those letters that are discussing history are reliable and trustworthy. So yeah, I believe Peter wrote 1 Peter and 2 Peter. And so he definitely testifies to the resurrection there. But as I said before, if you're doing like Jesus did with the Sadducees, you have to go to Paul's letters to debate with people who only accept Paul's letters.
Yeah. I think there's really good strong evidence for the 13 letters of Paul being written by Paul.
I agree.
I think the case on the Patriarch epistles is a bit weaker than those of Paul, but I think you've still got a case. At least, I think you've got a case. I just don't think it's as strong as the letters of Paul.
Especially Colossians and 2 Thessalonians is ridiculous, and even Ephesians. For scholars to be questioning those is absolutely, their reasons are just ridiculous.
Yeah.
And a lot of times the foundation, like somebody very prominent will just make an argument that's not very sound at all. And then all these scholars afterwards for centuries will follow that argument. But when you go back to the original grounding, it's just so weak. Castles made in the air. So yeah, it's sad that a lot of these, even First Peter, I mean, I think we have very, very good reason that First Peter, that the parallels to Peter's preaching in Acts to First Peter is awesome. We see Peter seems to uniquely want to talk about Isaiah 53. Isaiah 53 seemed to be a key text for Peter. When you compare him in Acts and you compare him and even in Mark, when you look at Mark, at Peter's behind Mark, which I think he was, and you compare him in First Peter, you see this awesome agreement of this testimony of Jesus as the suffering servant, as the pace in Greek, the servant of Yahweh. I think there are very strong arguments, and we need to make them and change their minds by God's will, by God's Spirit.
I think there are also some strong arguments from undesigned coincidences between Acts and letters of Paul, which I think vindicate the majority of the Pauline letters, including, I think, some really good ones between Acts and Ephesians and Colossians in particular, which support those as disputed letters, which I think have good support. Let's see. Ken McCracken says, and Paul says he was buried. Why mention burial? 1 Corinthians 15 is all about physical resurrection.
Well, I think that's one of the points. I do think burial for Paul there, or the original composers of the creed, it's kind of he died, the evidence is he was buried. He was raised, the evidence, the proof is, look at all these people and groups that he saw. So I think that's the main point of the burial, but it's also, as we see testified to in the Gospels and even in Acts and the sermons, we see that he was taken down and given a proper burial. And the unanimous testimony is it was by Joseph of Arimathea. So I do think it says he was buried, in the passive in the Greek. So buried by whom? Most likely the stories that we read in the Gospels probably came into their minds as they quoted this creed, and it's just like what a creed is, a summarized version. A very succinct version of long narrative accounts and long stories, kind of like even in the Nicene Creed, he was crucified under Pontius Pilate. Well, when we hear that, we know all the stories of Jesus standing before Pilate and the conversations he has with Pilate and the Barabbas account. We have all these stories just behind that one phrase, and so I think that's what you have also with he was buried. And it's interesting because he says he was raised on the third day. He was raised on the third day. That statement in the creed is interesting too, because that may be a historical reference to the fact that the women discovered it on the third day, and obviously discovered it empty.
So here's another question I have relating to that phrase, on the third day, in 1 Corinthians 15. So Paul says that Christ rose again on the third day in accordance with the scriptures. And later on in that chapter, he mentions Christ as the first fruits from among the dead, which reminds us of the Feast of First Fruits instituted in Leviticus 23.
Yeah.
And the Feast of First Fruits was instituted to be remembered or celebrated on the day following the Sabbath, the first Sabbath following Passover, which would be the Sunday. And Christ, of course, rises from the dead on the Sunday, which seems to point towards design, right? Either on the part of God supernaturally raising him from the dead on the Sunday in order to tie in with the first fruits and the theological import of that, or on the part of the apostles that want to make Jesus fulfill the theological symbolism, the Old Testament symbolism, and so they make him rise again on the third day. It seems to point away from the hypothesis of the disciples being honestly mistaken, which is the consensus view among critical scholarship today, that yes, the disciples sincerely believed Jesus had been raised from the dead, but they were sincerely mistaken. That seems to be one line of evidence that goes the other direction from that and points towards design, right? Would you agree with that argument?
I completely agree. And there is, and it's interesting when he says, according to the scriptures, is he even including the on the third day in that? He may be, as I said, making a historical point about that's just when they discovered him on the third day. But what is according to the scriptures is that he would be raised, which would of course still fit with that account, the account of the first fruits in Leviticus and others. I like what I have a quote in the book that I do from N.T. Wright on this, and I like what he says, because I think that even though there are some proof texts that you could point to for the resurrection, like Psalm 16 and others, I like how N.T. Wright basically says it's more, according to the scriptures, it's this whole story of the Old Testament as a whole, and it's different themes that all lead to a kind of death, redemption, and resurrection. And you see this again and again. You see it in Job, you see it with Joseph, you see it in the Psalms, you see it in Jeremiah, you see it in Isaiah 53, you see it all throughout the Old Testament. You see it even in the festivals and in Passover. And so I think I like that idea that seems to be the point of according to the scriptures. It's not just one, a few proof texts that we can point to and say that says resurrection only there. It's more the whole story of the scriptures.
And 1 Corinthians 15 does specifically indicate there's a resurrection, because he passes through death, he's cut off from the land of the living, and then God prolongs his days and allows him to see his seed, which suggests resurrection.
And he calls them the Passover earlier in 1 Corinthians 5, so that might even be another parallel. 1 Corinthians 5:7.
Slam RN on YouTube says, but Galatians would have been written sooner than Acts, right? I think you may be referring to my earlier point about Acts to Peter's sermon being an early source. Yes, but Galatians doesn't explicitly allude to the resurrection of Jesus, I think.
Galatians says he was raised from the dead.
Oh yeah. It says he was from the dead, sorry, but it doesn't refer to the resurrection appearances as well.
Right.
Yeah.
Galatian, I consider, along with James, I consider the earliest books written. So Acts, I would put Acts in the early 60s AD.
Yeah, I would tend to agree with that.
But I do think, as you said, I do think the sermons, though, what it records would go back to right after Pentecost.
Right. Mm-hmm. Slam RN says, we still need the testimony that Jesus was a man in human flesh before the resurrection, or that would really cause more problems than we already have today. Not quite sure what he's getting at there.
Where we have Galatians 4, he was born of a woman.
Mm-hmm.
Born under the law. That's very clearly meaning he was a human being, a Jewish human being. He was a descendant of David. Paul testifies to all those things. He was a descendant of David according to the flesh. That means as a human, he was a descendant of David. He was a Jewish descendant of David.
Ken McCracken says, James, the brother of Jesus, in his letter calls Jesus the Lord of glory, which makes sense from Jesus appearing to him as in 1 Corinthians 15.
Yeah, great parallel. Yeah,
it's not entirely certain. I think that James, the brother of Jesus, is the same author as wrote James. I think, right?
Again, it wouldn't be. It's not. I wouldn't say it's certain, but it is. It is the predominant tradition and testimony. Because any other James would be. It would have to be written very, very early to be like James, the son of Zebedee, because he died in the early 40s. He was the first apostle martyred. That was a great point about James, because James, the letter of James, it's usually talked about as not presenting Jesus as God, but that specific verse, that's a great evidence that James is proclaiming Jesus as God. That when he says the Lord of glory, that language is, especially in the Jewish context, it's specifically he's giving that glory that only Yahweh has to Jesus. And again, Jesus was. James, we know from Josephus, was stoned to death for blasphemy. And Dr. Bach, Darrell Bach from Dallas Theological Seminary in his book does an excellent job talking about how that blasphemy that James was condemned for probably was what he said about his brother.
Frank Christian says, "What's the name of the book, Justin's?" So that is.
Yeah, you need to link it. We need to link it. It's called The Bedrock of Christianity.
Yeah,
and it's on Amazon. You can just type in my name and Justin Bass and the Bedrock of Christianity.
Ken McCracken points out that the resurrection is right through the New Testament, from the Gospels to Acts to the letters of Revelation. Yep, very true.
Very true. And it's the center of every sermon in Acts, by the way. It's interesting that the cross isn't always mentioned, but the resurrection is always proclaimed in the sermons.
Okay, I don't think there's any further questions at this point. Is there anything else you want to talk about, or should we wrap up here?
Wrap up. Yeah, sorry the audio wasn't as good. Must be this hotel I'm staying at. Everybody's probably quarantined on the internet at the same time.
Actually, during the Q&A, it was excellent. I don't know why it was different during the presentation.
Yeah, that's weird.
And it's not that we can hear what you were saying. It was just a bit crackling.
Yeah, I know that. I hate it when that happens too.
All right. Well, have a great night. Thanks for coming on again.
Thank you, sir. God bless you.
God bless you too. Bye.
We'll see you. Bye.